Hi again. Today I'm going to be making this flat cap. This pattern is Vogue V8869, although when you're making a flat cap you don't particularly need to buy a pattern. There are lots of patterns which are available online and they're free to download. They may be slightly different in the way they're executed. You might have 2 darts at the back, you might have 3 darts at the back, but they're all much of a muchness. Now, the fabrics I'm going to use are very similar to a messenger bag that I made, which is here. So I'm going to use similar fabrics to match my messenger bag. So let's have a look at the fabrics. So these are the materials that I'm using for my hat. This is the same as the messenger bag that I made. It's a wool. I believe it was gifted to me, so I'm not entirely sure if it's a pure wool or if it's a wool blend. Yes, I could do the burn test, and I'll speak to you about burn tests another time. But just to be on the safe side, I'm going to waterproof it because it's being used as a cap. The Grosgrain ribbon is a nice strong ribbon, which is usually used on the inside of the cap around the headband area, just to hide your raw seams and also to go around the head. So I'm using black because it picks up the black in the wool, and it also works well with this purple that I'm using as my lining. So my lining material I was gifted by my mother some time ago. I know it's been in the family for years, and unfortunately at the edges and on the folds it does have some sun damage, but that's fine because there is sufficient to be able to cut and missing off the sun damage. I don't have any cotton which is going to match, so I'm using grey. Now there is a theory that there are 3 colours which will match any possible colour that you've got, and those are grey, ivory and rose. And I'll put up a picture in this video which actually shows you how they blend. I've used it before, I've used it on the messenger bag and it works perfectly, so I'm going to use it for this. Now there are only 4 pattern pieces for this cap, which is number 1, which is the top of the cap, the side, which is piece number 2, the brim, which is piece number 3, or the peak, and then you've got piece number 4, which is the brim insert. You can use anything you like for the brim insert. It used to be thick cardboard, or you could use plastic, you could use a piece cut from a milk bottle, or you can actually buy peaks, which you'd have to trim them to size because usually they're for baseball caps. I'm using buckram, and my normal buckram is actually quite thin, so I'm using 3 pieces of buckram, 2 of the standard buckram, and this piece which is actually a double-sided sticky buckram. Now there is some glue in the normal buckram, which is when you heat it with steam, that's how you shape it, but I'm using this piece sandwiched in the middle so that when I've actually heated it, that will fuse to the other 2 pieces and give me a thicker brim, and that's what I want. But I'm not going to do the fusing until after I have sewn my peak to the hat. Let's talk pattern matching. Now normally with this pattern it suggests that you cut everything on the bias, so the grain line is marked on your pattern pieces, and this suggests that the grain line should run this way, which is down the fabric, but that means that all of my pattern pieces will be cut on the diagonal. Now I didn't particularly want the diagonal to be running across, particularly with such a bold pattern. If you're using a Harris tweed or something with a finer pattern, then that's fine, you can do that, but if you've got a big bold pattern it doesn't always look right if it's running on the bias. So I've decided to cut it with the grain. So this is my grain line which is running down, and I've pattern matched so that when I sew the pieces together, so this is my peak, and as you can see these 2 pieces will cut like this, so that when I stitch them together they will match in the center front. And I've done the same with the top of my hat and also my side, and as you can see again it runs straight through. The other thing that will happen is when the peak goes on, because the peak goes on here, that is also matched, so it'll be the other way, the other piece which goes that side, and you can see that again it's pattern matched. I've interfaced all my pieces. all my main fabric pieces, and I've also marked them up with all the markings that you need. This particular interfacing is a woven interfacing. It's slightly stronger than the other one that you use, which is usually just sort of like a foamy non-woven pressed one, and I find that this works better for things where you need a little bit more strength, but that's fine. So the first thing that we've got to do is we've got to stitch our darts at the back. If you are unsure of the size of your head or the size of your hat in comparison to your head, then what I suggest you do is when you sew the darts, and your pattern piece may only have one dart, it may just have two pieces like this, baste it. Use a machine basting stitch, which is your longest stitch length, so that you can undo it. So these would be pinned together and basted. The dots are where you will finish stitching. So we would be stitching a 1 centimeter seam allowance on this from the edge to the point. And I'm going to baste it. And what you would normally do is once you've actually stitched it, this piece here, this diagonal, you would slash open and then press open. I'm not going to do that when I'm basting. What I'm going to do is I will press open, but I will just press that bit flat. That way, once I've got the side on, I can actually test the size of the hat. If it's too tight, then I can take a slightly less seam allowance, so I can take a 0.5 centimeter seam allowance. If it's too big, then I can take a bigger seam allowance, say 1.5 centimeters. But as I've got 3 darts, I can adjust it and make quite a good fit. Here we are with my darts sewn. I think I must have a thing for a 1 centimeter seam allowance, because when I check my pattern, this is actually a 6 mil or a 1/4 inch seam allowance, which is what I've sewn at now. As you can see, I've pressed my seams open and it's actually beginning to form the shape of the cap. So if I turn it right way out, we can see that this is now the back of the cap with some nice darts. What I'm going to do now is attach the side to the top. And what we need to do is we need to make sure that we line up our centre front lines, which is marked both sides, and then I'm going to put a pin through at 90 degrees and make sure that matches up. My next matching point will be this corner. Now this corner sits perfectly in there, like so, and then this then forms the back of the cap. There's a bit of ease going on there, and because we're turning a corner, there's a bit of ease going on here as well. So it's very important to make sure that this is pinned and stitched correctly. What I suggest, and what I'm going to do, is I'm going to pin it and I'm also going to sew around the edge of the hat first and stop at this point, and then I'm going to stitch that bit and join it up rather than try and turn this corner, because what I'm going to have to do at some point is actually either snip into that corner to take away the bulk of the fabric. So I'm going to pin now, and I'm just going to sew around this outside edge, and then I'll show you what I've done. Right, so I've sewn my seam, my 1/4 inch 6 mil seam all the way around, but I've stopped at the 2 points. This means that I can now line the rest of it up with the ease, as it needs to be eased in. So I'm going to pin there and then ease this and pin. Like so. I will even up my pins. So I can sew to this point here, along here, taking into account the additional fabric which is here, which I will just move out the way, and then I should have a nice neat corner turn on this side. Don't know if you can see that very well. And I'm going to do that on both sides. So I've sewn my sides up and it matches on the dot. This side I had a slight issue with, so I've actually re-sewn, but what's happened is because I haven't tried to turn the corner, on the inside it looks a mess, but on the outside I've got this nice curve here and also on the other side, just here. You can see it's curved quite nicely when the autofocus kicks in. You can also see right at the front of the cap that the pattern matching has worked and it's nice and neat and even. As you go around the sides, of course, it will actually tail off, but the front is where it matters. So what I can do now is this opening should be the size of my head. Bear in mind, yes, we will actually take a little bit in. So if it's slightly loose, don't worry when you measure it on your head. And if it's comfortable, then that's fine. If it's slightly too loose, then we can actually tighten up these and take a slightly bigger seam allowance at the back. And if it's slightly too tight, then you can loosen these off. If you've only taken a 6mm, then you're going down to a very narrow seam allowance. So just be careful how you sew that. So I'm going to try this on now and then let you know if it fits or not. So here we are, I'm trying the cap on, and as you can see it fits quite nicely. Yes, I haven't trimmed or put cuts or slits into the seam allowance, but it fits quite nicely. It's ever so slightly loose, but it does fit. I'm looking a bit normal wisdom there, but it does fit quite nicely. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to stitch up my darts at the back, and then I'm going to do exactly the same that I've done with this, with the lining, so that we're ready to go when we need to insert the lining. Here we are. So I've just stitched my darts properly now. I left the basting in because I was stitching on the same point, and I've pressed open. I've also pressed open these seams at the edge, but not round the edge, because what I need to do first is I need to clip my curves really close. Let's just zoom in. There we go. I need to clip really close to the stitch line and just take some little V's out so that when I turn it, it will actually sit flat, because when you turn those, all of that will actually start crumpling together. So that's what I've got to do now, is just cut out some V's and then I can turn it. Next step after this is to do the peak. So I'm going to clip this, turn it, and then I'm going to press, and I'm using a pressing cloth because I don't want this wool to melt. If you've got a blend or if you've got a wool and you have it too hot, it will start to melt. So I'm not going to try that without a pressing cloth. So here we are. I've snipped all the way around my curves, which means that when I turn it the right way, I'll get a much nicer, flatter seam once I've pressed it. And as I said, I'm going to use a pressing cloth because I don't want any of this wool to melt. So once we've done that, we'll get on with doing the peak. So here is our cap peak. I've already stitched it at the 1/4 inch or the 6mm mark. You can see that it's still got the lines, the marking lines on it. I've got to clip it and press it, but I just wanted to show you, because of the way that I'd lined it up, that now that it's stitched, it's perfectly matched. So you can see the seam line is nice and neat, and it matches all the way around to the edges. And when this is attached to the main cap, we'll also make sure that this is aligned. This might be the right, yes, this is the right way. So these pieces would attach here so that we will get a seamless look on the cap. So I'm just going to go and clip this, and then we will insert the buckram and just make sure that it fits, because we don't want the buckram sticking out of the end. We just need to trim it if it does, because otherwise we will be stitching through the buckram. It's not a problem if you've got one layer, but with 3 layers I don't want to stitch through it. So I'll just do the trim, turn and press, and then we'll see how the buckram sits inside it. Here's my notched brim. I have pressed it so that when I flip it, just to show you, There we go. Got a nice smooth brim to the hat. The next thing I'm going to do is insert my buckram, and as I told you, I've got 3 pieces of buckram, so I just need to line them up, and then we just need to insert them into the brim like so and push them down as far as they will go. Avoiding the seam allowance, making sure it's all on one side, on the inside, otherwise it will sit funny. Right, so that's all inside, and as you can see, we've now got a slightly stiffer brim, and then this will be attached to the cap. Now that's upside down, that will go onto there, so this will then be pinned. Let's turn it this way so you can see, aligning here. Before we do that, the pattern suggests that where you've actually sewn this seam here, you can top stitch or edge stitch really close to it. It doesn't really matter whether you do or not. I don't particularly like it, so I'm not going to. You can also do the same either side of here. It just helps hold your seam if you do stitch either side, but I'm not going to. So I'm just going to finish off inserting my buckram, and I'm also going to trim it because it's sticking out a little way. Just before I do that, I just wanted to show you that on the edges of the cap brim, I've trimmed really close to the stitch line. This is so that I don't have so much to stitch through and there's not so much bulk, so it really does cut down on the bulk. I nearly forgot to say that before we attach the brim to the hat, we need to put the lining in and baste it in. Now I've made up the lining exactly the same way as I made up the main hat, but I haven't turned it the right way out because of course this inside, which is the right side, should be inside the cap. So that will just insert inside the cap, and then we line up all the seams at the back, pin it, and then we just baste it, machine baste it all around the edge, and then I'll attach the cap peak. This is my cap inside out. The lining has been basted or tacked to the hat. Oh, I have to pin it. Basting is just another word for tacking, and I use my longest machine stitch, and on my machine that's a length 4. So it's now holding everything nicely in place for the hat. Just make sure the lining's pushed into the peak. And now all I need to do is I need to pin my peak to my hat. I'm also making sure that I line it up because I've pattern matched it. So I will pattern match it like this and pin, avoiding the buckram because the buckram is really close. And then we just carry on pinning like so, and to here. And you can see that even with the curve, once I've got this pin in place, I'll show you that the pattern matching sits really nicely. So I'm going to finish pinning, and then I'm going to baste. I'm just going to tack this on because then we've got one final step to finish the hat. So I'll see you in a bit. Very nearly there. So my cap peak is now on and it's lined up. I see it's ever so slightly out. I'm not worried because this piece won't actually be seen that much because it will be sitting like this. So that's fine. But what we now need to do is we need to attach our ribbon. So what I need to do is I need to fold a little bit over so that it's hidden, and then starting at your centre back, you overlap it slightly and you bring it in. Let me just zoom in a bit. So you've folded it over and you overlap it anywhere up to 1.3 centimetres. So I'm going probably 1 centimetre because my stitch line here is 0.5 centimetre or 6 mil. And then what we do is we pin that, And I know it looks like it's odd because it's actually going over the edge of the fabric. That's because once this is stitched, it will be turned to the inside like so, and then you can hand stitch it all the way around to the lining. I tend to just tack it at certain points, usually where I've got my seams, and also at the peak and at the corners of the peak, just to keep it in place. So I'm going to pin this on, and then I'm going to move over to the machine and show you stitching this on. So here's my hat. I've pinned the Grosgrain ribbon on all the way around, as you can see. And I've overlapped this bit at the edge and folded it back on itself so that I will have a nice neat edge. And what I will do is I will just put a couple of stitches potentially of black cotton in there just to hold it. Once we've stitched this edge, as I said, once it's folded in, you can either hand stitch it all the way around to the lining, but I'm just going to tack it to various points. What I've done with the brim here is, because there is the buckram inside the brim, or you might have plastic or something, this is just overlaid ever so slightly over my stitch line, and I'm going to stitch, I don't know if you can see it there, you can see it, there's a line on the edge of the Grosgrain ribbon, and I'm going to use that as my stitch line. It just means it's very easy line to follow, and as long as I do that, it'll all look nice and neat. I will show you what I do when I come to the brim, because as the buckram hasn't been steamed, you can see it's still relatively flexible. Once it's steamed, it will actually go a little bit stiffer, and that will make it much harder to get it through the machine. The other thing I'm going to do to help is my machine, yours may as well, has this panel which slides off. It allows you to sew around sleeves and things, and it will just also make it slightly easier when I'm sewing the hat. So I'm going to line it up now and then show you some of the stitching. So here we are ready to sew. My presser foot is lined up with this line on the Grosgrain ribbon, and I'm starting just a little bit behind my center line so that as I come across, it will just catch all of those layers and hold them nice and tight. So I'm going to hold my thread out of the way, and I'm just going to hand turn the first couple of stitches while the pin is still in, and then I'm going to remove my pin, and then I can just start stitching, making sure that I'm following that line on the Grosgrain ribbon. I'm going to go whiz round now to the brim, and then I'll show you how the brim can be flexed as you go round. We're just coming up to the brim of the hat, or the peak of the hat, and because I haven't, as I said, I haven't steamed it, I can now hold it out of the way and flex it as I come up to it. I'll just go a little bit further. Let's take that pin out. And as you can see, the brim is flexing around the machine, so I can keep this nice and straight as it flexes because my brim isn't too stiff. If my brim had been too stiff, then I would have struggled with this stage. But as it is, I can just keep it in quite a nice straight line, stitch nice and evenly without too much trouble. So I'll complete that now, and I'll show you what it's like once the Grosgrain ribbon is finally attached. So here we are. Cap's now got the lining, well, the band stitched in, and I've also folded and pressed it. I've also put a couple of stitches in here just to hold this the opening closed. What I've got to do now is I've got to do some stitching just to hold that inside, and I'll do another press along this bit of the peak. But what I'm going to do now is, my peak is still a little bit floppy, So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to put my pressing cloth on, and I'm going to press it with steam, which will actually then melt all the glue in that middle piece. If you remember, the middle piece of buckram was double-sided with glue on both sides, and this will actually firm up the peak once you allow it to cool. It will just melt that glue and then just get that peak nice and firm. You may be able to see, I can certainly feel that it's stiffer than it was, and it will hold quite nicely. Once we have tacked down the Grosgrain ribbon to the lining in various places, and I'm going to press this seam again just to hold a little bit tighter than it currently is. The very last thing to do is to take the sides of the cap and just put a couple of tacking stitches to hold the sides of the cap to the brim, just to prevent it moving. You don't have to, but if you prefer a sort of a proper flat cap, then that just holds it. So here we are, we have a finished flat cap. It's not quite lined up across the front, but that's fine, I can live with that. But it is tacked at the front, and it is all tacked on the inside. The band is tacked to the lining. So there we are, that's how you make a flat cap. So thank you again for watching, and as ever, if you've enjoyed this video, please subscribe below and drop me a line. Let me know if there's anything that you'd like to see me make in the future. Thank you.